Today, we're going to talk about issues in marriage that are ongoing issues that are either never solved or take a long time to solve. With our special guests, Tim and Jen Kosuda. Stay tuned.
You don't want to miss it. You're listening to Marriage Mania, where we are audacious, sagacious, and tenacious for the Lord to uphold godly marriages and to raise fervent children who are countercultural and stand for biblical truth.
Welcome to our channel. We're so happy to have you here today. And as I mentioned in the beginning of our podcast, we'll be talking about issues in marriage that are either never solved or take a long time to solve. And we're excited to talk about this topic because there's a lot of marriages out there that are hurting. And in this conversation, we're going to have our friends, Tim and Jen, and that's going to be really exciting. We can dig deep and talk about some issues in marriage. But before we get started, please subscribe here and get that message out there. Share with a friend. This allows us to get our message out there and share Jesus with many. So let's get started with our friends. So we're so excited to have our friends, Tim and Jen Kosuda. And I want to introduce them. I'm so excited. So they've been married since 2009. They're parents to 3 amazing children and one on the way next month. So we're excited to hear about that. Tim, he is a data analytics, and he has his MBA from New York University. Jen has worked as a public school teacher since 2006 and is a founder as well as an author of The Art of a Messy House. She has books and blogs and podcasts that you can find, and I'll make sure to share that at the end of this podcast. And since they met in 2005, God's hand has been on them, and they have a great testimony. You need to check out their podcast, the latest podcast on that. Both being brought up in different kinds of churches, the Lord has truly worked in their lives and their families to guide them step by step to raising their children in the Lord. And she loves Ecclesiastes 4:12. It reminds us all, though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. I love that verse. That was a verse that we use in our marriage. It's beautiful because it just shows a great unity, and God must be the center of the family. So we are so excited to have Tim and Jen. And before I get them to speak, I do want to say how I met Jen. So Jen and I, we were friends on Instagram and still are friends. And we started messaging each other. We started talking, and it's just been such a wonderful conversation. The Lord has really brought us together, just bringing encouragement to one another, and just sharing life. And so it's just been such a blessing to me. And I'm just so happy, Jen, to call you my friend and my sister in Christ. So please share and tell our audience about you guys.
Well, thank you. I feel the same way. And thank you for having us on here. This is actually our first podcast or anything in the ministry doing it together. So thank you for the opportunity. Yes. So I founded the Art of a Messy House books, blog, and now podcast about 5 years ago, maybe a little over 5 years ago is when it really started to unfold. And Tim has been the biggest encourager for that and all the steps, and just really giving his blessing and also just giving his expertise with all the technology, because that is the side of it that I don't, doesn't come naturally to me. And so he has designed my website and all of the things like that. And so I'm very grateful, but I'm also really grateful that he's given us this opportunity to come on here.
Thanks, Jen. That was great. And I'm so thankful again to have you here as well. So before we get into this conversation, we want to lay a foundation about marriage and potential conflicts that are resolved or not resolved. So Michael, do you want to give an overview of that?
Yes, today we wanted to talk about issues in marriage that are ongoing, issues that are either never solved or take a long time to solve. According to a well-respected researcher in the marriage field, John Gottman, who is cited by Christians and non-Christians alike for his great research, he said that 69%, 2/3 of conflicts in marriage are never solved. I mean, we gotta let that sink in for a second. I think that's an astounding statistic. Can that really be true? I probably wouldn't believe it if John Gottman didn't say it, that most of our conflicts in marriage are never solved. 2/3 of them are never solved. They
Mm.
are ongoing throughout the marriage. Only 1/3 of our conflicts get ironed out, meaning we address them, maybe argue about it, and we come to some kind of resolution and move on. That only happens with 1/3 of our issues. 2/3 of our conflicts continue for the life of the marriage. And how many of the 1/3 that get resolved eventually get resolved after some time? And, why does that happen? It would seem that the conflict resolution experts would agree that the majority of our issues in marriage is because we're not using good conflict resolution techniques. That's probably the number one reason for ongoing issues. We're advocating our own position, trying to get our own way, and not listening to the other side and learning their perspective. If there's one area in marriage where we need to be experts on, it's in the area of conflict resolution, how to deal with difficult conversations, issues in the marriage, areas where we disagree. There's going to be a lot of areas of disagreement in a marriage. That's just a fact. And when we handle them well, the process of resolving these conflicts can make our marriages stronger, more intimate, as we are meeting each other's needs and putting each other first while learning about the other person and their preferences. When we handle our disagreements poorly, it can wreak havoc on the marriage. So a lot of the reason for conflict in a marriage is just poor conflict resolution techniques. Very few people get any kind of training in this area, and they're doing it all wrong, quite frankly, in a way that makes the situation worse. We can have a lot less conflict in marriage, certainly a lot less intense or destructive if we just do it better. But that's not sometimes the reason for an ongoing issue in the marriage is that the other person is just not capable of meeting your expectations on this particular thing, which can be frustrating because when you address an issue with the person, you hope that they see this is really bugging you and they want to change and work to change. But sometimes they're just not capable of this change right now. Like if the problem is an alcohol addiction, but they don't see a problem right now, or they're incapable of fixing it right now. They're just not there yet. Or they have anger issues that's deep rooted in their personality and don't know how to stop venting their anger on others. In their mind, they keep trying, but they keep failing. In your mind, they're not even trying because they don't see their intentions. You only see their actions and their failure to remedy the problem. If you don't have this as an issue, it looks so easy to overcome. So why don't they just stop? It's because this is an issue for them that they don't know how to resolve. So sometimes the reason for an ongoing issue is the person is just not capable right now of resolving the issue, or they don't see it as a problem right now to even be working on, which can really be frustrating. But then you have to pray and wait for the capability and healing to come about in their lives. But sometimes the reason for an ongoing issue is that neither position is right or wrong. It's just different. And both feel very strongly about their position or what they want, and there's no ready-made solution. Each feels very strongly about their preference and would feel hurt and sadness if that preference is not fulfilled. Like having children. One wants 5 children, the other wants 1. Is either position right or wrong? No, just different. And each may feel very strongly about their preferences. I feel God is calling us toward a bigger family, and I would really feel fulfilled if I had a big family. But the other feels God is calling us to stop at 1 child or 2. I feel fulfilled at 1 or 2, and the idea of taking care of more kids is undaunting or all encompassing, and I want more balanced life. Whatever the reasons are, which aren't usually right or wrong, just different preferences. I believe it's the third category that we're talking about today, an ongoing issue where we disagree and neither side is right or wrong. We just have different preferences and feel strongly about it. How do we work through that? And our guests today, Jen and Tim, provide a great example of working through this in a way that ultimately brings the marriage closer.
Yeah, and I totally agree because it could be really difficult to work through situations because, like you said, it could be something in our hearts that we desire, and the other person just has to think through it. So, Jen, I and Tim, would you please share? I would love to hear how you guys dealt with some conflict in your marriage.
Yeah, I think when we went into our marriage, I don't know that we initially had the conversation around how many children we like. We didn't have that like formal conversation and saying you want 2, I want 3, et cetera,
Mhm.
or vice versa. And we even delayed having children for, I guess, 5 years into marriage before kind of our first, or who's our oldest now is 10 years old. So after we had our first and then our second, I guess 2.5 years later, I think the topic of a third kind of started to creep up every now and again. And
Mm.
I think in my mind, I assumed we had two. We had 2 beautiful children, a healthy boy, healthy girl. We're good then. I mean, why push forward with anything further? I mean, because then we run the risk of other things, maybe other, and don't get me wrong, things weren't even easy with them either, because we had a number of food allergies that we dealt with. So I think, having gone through what we went through, I kind of assumed that we were good with two. And then every now and again, as I was mentioning, Jen always would kind of bring up, or on occasion would bring up, that her heart, that she always felt a third, that she was meant to have at least three children. And I think we would kind of have the conversation a little bit, but then ultimately ignore it. Or, and whether it was me deliberately doing that, or just the nature of kind of, don't look at it, and then it's no longer there. But I think that kind of carried on for a number of years, where it would bubble back up. And I don't know that, I don't want to speak for Jen, but I think it would come back up in different ways, and kind of, perhaps not that in and of itself boil over, but maybe other things compounding. And then that would kind of be something that was underlying, I would say, a disagreement, a misalignment in kind of where we felt where we should ultimately be as parents, and around the number of children that we would have. I mean, do you want to add to kind of?
Yeah, no, it was around that time where our second was like 2.5, and that's when I really felt the stirring, and I felt I would wake up from dreams and be in prayer time and just feel this on my heart. And so when we would have the conversation, I don't think my delivery was always the best delivery. I think I waited for times when, I don't know, looking back, I could have done it a little bit better, but it was exactly what Tim just described. It was like this cycling back of unresolved issues, ignore it for a while, then come back to it. We would both say we're both praying about it, which we were, but we weren't doing that together. And to what Tim was saying before, we didn't have it easy, because our oldest had an anaphylactic reaction at 7 months old. We had to call an ambulance in a snowstorm. We had to hold the oxygen over him. It was a lot of, and then we learned he might have 21 food allergies, and it was just and he was sick all the time. It was a lot. And then when my daughter came, it was after a miscarriage, and I went through a season of having undiagnosed postpartum anxiety for a while. I didn't know. And then the post-traumatic stress from my son's reaction. So there was all that. And I went through a really dark time during that time. And so that was a lot on Tim, and just in general on us. And so once all that lifted, I always talk about the testimony of being healed from the decades of anxiety. And that was really that pit was where God healed me through a lot of steps, and aligned help along the way. But things were looking so great, and things were great, and it was so different from back then, and we hadn't had an easy experience. But then when I had this put on my heart, I almost was like, God, but all that, right? But it was almost this peace that would come. That's not going to happen this time. You're in a different space. You're a different person. You've been healed. And so when I would present it, that's what I was trying to present, but I think my emotions would overshadow.
Yeah, I feel like I can relate with you. And it's this deep mother desire of fulfillment to want to have another child, but then how do you present that in a way that doesn't come across, demanding, or, comes across loving of, this is what I believe the Lord is leading me to, but is it my feelings, or, how do we come to this conclusion or this resolution to be able to make a decision? And just a quick, I guess, example for us is, us wanting more children and taking different steps to try different things, and potentially even going to in vitro and getting counseling from our pastor. And we already knew inside that, Michael was like, this isn't what we're going to do. And I was like, I can't, I can't just give that chance up. And, I had to surrender it, because it wasn't where God was calling us, so sometimes those kind of decisions are hard, where, you're having to submit. And but then sometimes, like you guys talking through it, you knew that God was desiring, that you had that desire in your heart to have more children and have a bigger family. Um,
Yeah, and then all those issues like you were talking about is you always wonder, do I bring this up? How often do I bring it
yeah,
up? Is it better just to ignore it? Because when we do
yeah.
bring it up, it just causes an argument. And
Mm-hmm.
and those things can kind of play with your mind all the time when you're dealing with these
Mm-hmm.
ongoing issues, and that's tough to navigate because you don't want to just let it go and suppress it
Mm-hmm.
because you got a need there, a desire that you want to express and you want to be fulfilled, but at the same time, if there's negative consequences that come from bringing it up, it's like, do I bring it up? I feel like I need to address it, but I don't want to have another argument again. And it's just like those issues are tough.
Yeah, and I think too it brings in a lot of hurt, right? And with conflict and not having that final answer of like, okay, are we going to do this or we're not? It can fester in the heart, and it could cause some resentment or some thoughts or some friction in marriage. So, Jen, talk about that. Did you deal with pain? And Tim, how are you experiencing this tension as well? So maybe you guys can kind of tackle that.
I think I did have a lot of fear um,
Mm.
in what we went through. As Jen mentioned, she kind of went through a tough season following the birth of our daughter. And I was very fearful that either we'd have to relive that again and seeing like where she went through and just seeing her in such a kind of, I don't want to make it over dramatic and call it a low place, but in my mind it was, and seeing her like that and just gripped by a lot of fear and whatnot. And then also kind of, and our daughter was relatively healthy compared to our son. But then the other side of that was we just went through another dramatic experience with our son with all the allergies and
Mm-hmm.
having to navigate all that. So I think, and then I'm also the pragmatic one of the two, where Jen is very heart driven, very emotion driven, and I'm always like, all right, how much is that going to cost? I come from a data and analytics background, so everything is a calculation in some form, or if the research stuff, and that's just kind of how I'm wired. So I would say the combination of that didn't lend itself to me kind of even being able to have that conversation from a good place, right? I was coming from a place of fear, not even kind of lifting it to God yet at that point. As Jen mentioned earlier, I think we were praying, but largely at that point, it was separate. And I think that was ultimately, not to get ahead, but I think that was kind of an area of that we had to kind of come together and start unifying our prayer, being together, doing devotionals together. And I don't think we necessarily did that purposely to kind of get an answer necessarily to should we have more children or not. But in doing so, I think that's where we kind of arrived at this place of, and I don't even remember specifically about it, but I think one day I kind of more or less woke up having more of a peace around the idea of it and more of an openness to consider having a third child. Whereas I mean, I had a wall up, and at that point it was, we'll revisit the conversation. It was like this deferral technique, and whether deliberate or not, and it really wasn't, but I think there was a lot behind it all where it would say, okay, we'll revisit the conversation in 3 months, in 6 months, at some point in the future. And I think at that point we kind of came together, and I perhaps I surprised her, or maybe she thought that she uh, kind of put me into submission finally, and I gave in. But it wasn't through that. It was kind of a piece that kind of came over me, or just a willingness to consider it at this point. Where prior to that, it was like absolutely not. Um, I mean, in my mind, it was an absolutely not due to kind of the aforementioned reasons. But I think at that point, it was through God allowing me to let down my guard, maybe to get over some of that fear and kind of lift it to Him. And for however like that the veil kind of was taken down, where allowed me to kind of think from Jen's perspective. She's a very empathetic person. I'm like the get over it type, but like I was able to kind of at that point be able to see, or at least attempt to, very much a work in progress in that space, but kind of however we kind of arrived there at ultimately making the decision to say, you know what, if it's in God's will to do so, and it's kind of part of His plan, then let's start trying it, and we'll kind of see where it goes. So.
And actually, when we were preparing for this, like when we were going over the topic, I actually didn't even know that he had a moment of waking up. We never had that conversation, which was really great to kind of have this conversation, that he woke up and had that peace, because I felt it from him, but I didn't know how that happened. So it was really cool to kind of talk about this and like have that. But even going back to when I would present it, and it was just this like cycle. And I knew what he feared, because I had this, I'm going to call it radical, but because it was radical, it really is where God shifted my life and broke these chains of anxiety. And this moment, it took a lot of steps to get to that moment, but there was a moment. And I knew when I walked out of the space that this had happened in, that I was changed. And I remember I even called him and said, I am free of anxiety. You are not going to believe me. I know it's going to take years. And that was something that even in my relationship with the Lord, like he continued to remind me, like people are not going to just overnight believe you have been healed of anxiety. And so when I would, but I knew it, I felt it. And I knew that confirmation that it wasn't going to happen again. I didn't want to go through the whole thing again. Like, I was like, oh, do I really want to be pregnant again? If I'm really being honest, like that wasn't even that, but it was the desire that I felt that he put on my heart. And that God also gave me the comfort in knowing that it wasn't going to happen the way it happened after my daughter. And, that confidence was coming from him, because it wasn't coming from me at that time. And so when I would present it, and then it would be like, I would feel it rejected, I would also be reminded of what I went through. And then I would start to feel a little bit of shame and guilt of that and what I took our family through, but then be reminded. So it was almost like people still don't believe me. Right. And then God, I would have to bring it to God, because then that would also get me upset. And I would be like, well, I know I'm healed, but even the person closest to me here does not believe it. Can you help me show it, like in a way, like, can you reveal it to him? And it was a lot of like that battling internally with it too. So then when we finally came together, it was a night where it was just like, it was not a good tension, but we brought it up again. It was tension. And I think I even said in that conversation was, I don't believe that God would bring us together and give us two separate things that we're supposed to do about this. Like has to be a resolution that he already has for us. It's already planned for us. So we have to surrender it to him. We have to put it in his hands and just like God, like, and that's when we really started to pray together about that, because it was, even when we were doing the devotionals together, and that was really great. And that was really important. And it is, I don't know. I think it was uncomfortable to even bring that into our prayer. Like, God, what do you want us to do about having a baby? Like, even just saying that out loud was a really difficult thing, at least for me, to like put that out there and to speak that actually out. And so once we started doing that, that's when I feel like we literally surrendered it together. And we're like, we want what you want for us. So show us and make us like-minded.
I mean, I think that's beautiful and amazing, because it's hard to do that. You know, there has to be a humility to be able to accept, okay, maybe the answer is not right now, whether it's yes or no, but we have to make sure that we put our marriage first and coming together. And like you said, you guys were doing Bible studies together and giving it to the Lord, surrendering to the Lord. I know that it can be really difficult not to be able to have that heart desire come fulfilled like immediately. You know, you're just like, okay, I need patience and I need to wait on you, Lord. And especially with your spouse and him coming to the conclusion that he did. And then just this entire podcast, um, bringing it up and you guys talking about it is still like resolving things and knowing things that maybe you didn't specifically talk about, back then. And your conflict, I think you said it was like a year or two. So, I mean, that's a lot, to deal with.
Yeah, and I like what y'all did in the meantime. While there's an ongoing issue that's going on, I think what's really important is what do we do about that in the meantime while it's just going on, and we can pray. Well, the biggest thing we can do, as you were saying, is pray for God to work on the other person, to work on me, to work on us, to
Mhm.
find that win-win solution out there that maybe we're overlooking. To change one or both of our hearts to come together in agreement.
Mhm.
And, I also like the answer in James 1:19, which says, be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, because man's anger does not produce the righteousness of God. And instead of
Mhm.
getting angry at God and angry at our spouse, and instead of, or ignoring the issue or trying to persuade the other person by constantly advocating our position, the best approach is to learn the other person's position by asking a lot of questions. Just keep asking questions and give statements of empathy. It's counterintuitive because it seems like I'm just supporting your position, which will cause you to be more fixed in your position. But research bears out the opposite. The more I advocate for my position, the more the other person has a tendency to just close their ears and not listen. The more I listen to you and empathize with you, the more open you tend to be about my position and seeing why I think the way I think. And the more likely there will be solutions that open up to us when we have a deeper understanding of what's going on with each of us.
Yeah, I mean, this is just so good because it can apply to everything, right? Like a baby, I mean, it's a big deal to bring it. I'm not making that any small thing because to bring a child into this world, there's so much. We have responsibility, there's cost and all kinds of things, but it also shows us the importance of resolving these conflicts and walking through them and, bringing each other along in the journey through prayer. And I love how you guys, like I said before, you guys did devotions and we talked about that. And how Tim was seeking the Lord and you were seeking the Lord, and then you're both seeking the Lord and just having a peace because the Lord says that, his peace surpasses all understanding. Sometimes we just don't know, like, okay, Lord, you're giving me peace to walk this step. And so I'm taking the step now. We're going to have a child and you're going to provide everything, And so it's beautiful because your family, you have almost four babies. Well, you do have four babies. Your fourth one's just not physically here yet. We're in your hands, but it's beautiful because your family is growing and you're going to be, officially a family of six, and that's absolutely beautiful. And the Lord tells us, to bring our petitions to Him, to bring our concerns, to pray without ceasing, right? And whatever we have in our hearts, to bring it to Him because we don't know if it's of us or is it the Lord guiding us into a direction, that's a purpose for His will in our lives and in our family. So I want to ask because it looks like we answered a lot of amazing questions, and I love how you guys went deep into your story. And I just want to know too, like, how was your marriage impacted with this decision? Once you came to the conclusion, once you were pregnant, like, how has that impacted you as a family? And did it bring you guys closer, to be able to deal with other things in life and conflict that may come up or has come up during that time frame of your third child?
First and foremost, having the third child in and of itself was an absolute blessing.
Oh.
And he was a beautiful, healthy baby, and we got to see something that the first two were so close in age, that we got to see another side of a family where an older brother and sister can have such a relationship with a younger child that I couldn't ever imagine. So until I experienced that really kind of validate kind of the decision to have a third, and now we'll soon be blessed with a fourth. But kind of which which was
Y'all are busy parents.
which was completely God's plans, and not a hard conversation Jen or I had to have. So, but back to your point, or your question, I really think that it really was something that allowed us to kind of really grow together. And I think Jen building her ministry, following that, or kind of along that time, I think we both kind of come together now as Jen's kind of building up, um, just having such a strong faith. And I've kind of, I grew up in a very Christian household, but until Jen and I came together, did I really come to know Jesus? And even I'm growing and watching her. So I think that was kind of like the first of a big growth for both of us, to be quite honest, that I think we were able to realize that we are able to navigate these things, tough conversations. And don't get me wrong, we, like every other couple that's been married, these are, I mean, I don't want to say daily, weekly things, but I don't want to paint the picture like everything's perfect. But I think we now realize, like, we do need to come together and bring things together. And I think we've gone through a couple other big decision points with our children and other things that I think we were a little more proactive in going to bringing it to God together, and kind of coming away with more clarity, more of a clear answer and direction. So I do really think that we've kind of really come a long way from that time. And I don't want to say it was necessary to go through that, because it's God's path and ultimately how we arrive there. But I do believe we've grown a lot since then, and we're continuing to navigate that. And I think, as was mentioned earlier, I mean, we're two different personalities, two different ways of communicating. So that's going to continue to be an ongoing work in progress, and trying to better understand the other side's kind of point of view on things, or just how we communicate together. But I do think that being able to navigate big decisions in that manner really changed in that way, and how we can collectively bring these things to God. And we don't necessarily do that every time, right? I think we're shortening that cycle of kind of spinning our wheels, and kind of realizing, like, yeah, you know what, we need to not go our separate paths, but kind of bring this together, and ultimately lean in and kind of let him do the hard work, right? I think that's when we realize it's kind of less of us trying to do the heavy lifting, and the more that we can raise to him. I think oftentimes you get a clearer path, a picture, the door will open for you, or be closed shut, right? But I think having to remind, at least for my own self, to remind myself to bring these things, both individually and along my partner with Jen, and kind of do that, kind of back to the verse that you said. I think the three chords are stronger, and kind of reminding ourselves that we don't need to do it further, just wait till we boil over, but try to be more proactive in doing that in all things. And I think we've done a lot better job of doing that, and even with our kids, and bringing prayer and being able to pray for big things in front of them, and being that example to them, I think kind of goes a long way, and even showing them of like how they should be also in their prayer life and growing, and what the types of decisions, how big or how little, that we should always be bringing it together to God.
I was just going to say, it just goes back to even the scripture that you had mentioned of being slow to speak. For me, like learning to pause, being a very passionate person, and like I have to learn, or it really has taught me to pause in my emotions, in the whatever it is before me, in the stress of whatever it is, and just bring it to God, recognize the need for him to be at the center, and just pause. So it's not my reaction or our reaction, but instead like him leading us to react and be proactive.
Yes, and as you guys pointed out, we all have arguments, but God says be angry, but just don't sin. We're all going to have angry moments. Just be careful how we vent that anger. And the problem is not what we're arguing about. A lot of times, but how we are arguing. How we argue can either bring the marriage closer, or it can move it apart. How we argue can lessen the amount and intensity of our arguments, but we will never have a conflict-free marriage. And according to the experts, a conflict-free marriage is not the healthiest marriage, since it is through conflict, working out our disagreements, that we become closer, more intimate. Counselors actually worry if they hear a couple say they never argue. They worry that there may be some needs that are going unmet, unexpressed, or suppressed, and that will eventually cause negative symptoms in the marriage, like resentment or passive aggressiveness, or even a marriage that implodes or explodes. And some issues will never be resolved, as we're talking about, and we have to figure out how to deal with an ongoing issue that doesn't hurt the marriage. We may never come to an agreement as to how many children we want, but ignoring the issue is a common response, but ignoring it can cause the issue to get worse because it's not being addressed. It can boil underneath and explode. Constantly advocating our position is not the answer either, because we just tune out that, as just nagging, so the proper response, I think, during that time is to pray and seek God for that solution that maybe we're overlooking, and to seek understanding of our spouse. Ask a lot of questions, and that opens up the other person to, they understand. They're seeking to understand me. And as we understand each other more, we're open to the other person's side, while at the same time, we may open ourselves up to a solution that we never saw before because we have a deeper understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, I think that is amazing. And so I appreciate you guys saying what you said. And then just one last question. What advice would you give to couples who may be going through a similar situation, and we've given a lot of great things that they could use as tools, but like, what would you guys give as advice to other couples?
When I look back at the beginning of our relationship, I often wish I had learned to take the thoughts captive better. So like when you're having a conflict, it's very easy to let doubts or the feelings just plant those seeds in your mind. Like, you're meant to be together. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, there's a big issue that is divided. Maybe we're not meant to be together. And like, I knew that stuff was like, rebuke that, because that was not true. I knew that. But those things can come in if we're not careful to pluck them out when they come in, and to really pause to like say, okay, no, God put us together. We're here. So now this is an opportunity to see God. So that's one. And also really, life gets really busy. It can get really busy in this world, and just seeking to pause, to recognize, to do things together. If the lives get too busy, like sometimes I feel like once I start to feel like we're having parallel lives just because of all the busyness of the kids and all those things, I think that it's important to pause and be like, what can we do to bring this back together? Right? Like, what can we do to slow down in the busy, to really like be intentional with our time? So I think my advice would be intentional with your time with God together. That devotional time at night or in the morning or whatever works for you may seem like just a short amount of time, but that is really important time. And it doesn't always, like, we go through seasons where it's really busy. We're just like, we're tired. We're just going to go to bed. But recognizing that is a choice, that time, being intentional with time with God together, and also being intentional with time with each other is really important.
That's great advice. And definitely, because like you said, we're so busy. Life can be so busy. You can get so exhausted. I know for me, I can get so tired, and also figuring out the right time to bring up conversations. Like for us, I can't bring up any kind of conversation after 7:30.
No, not a good time.
Because he's
I'm
tired.
winding down.
Yeah,
big time.
he's an early bird. So
get up really early.
The best time to have a conversation with my husband is 5 o'clock in the morning. But
you can wake me up at 2 o'clock in the morning. That'd be a good time to talk.
Yeah.
But
No, it's funny you say that, because we often would say the same thing, because both of us wake up rather early as well. And I think oftentimes when we would land on these kind of tougher conversations, it would be right before bed. And it's like neither of us are in the right headspace because we're both morning people. But yeah, I think, kind of knowing when to bring these up is equally as important as it is to how to bring it up, kind of due to how our clocks work.
Yes, I guess knowing your spouse, right? Knowing knowing the right time. I learned that in earlier our marriage, like the early part of our marriage was like, I want to have these deep conversations at like 8 o'clock at night. And it didn't work out. It was not good.
And personality issues as well, where because Tanya likes to address things in the moment, right now. Let's get this done. And I'm a processor. I've got to process it for a while and think about it and get my emotions under control and
I'm like,
talk
let's
about
get
it
it
when
done.
I'm calm. It's like, I want to think about this. Let's talk about it the next morning. But no, let's address it now, because you may not come back to it the next morning. But as she got confidence that I would come back and address it when things were calm, then she would kind of let it go for now, so I could process it. So working those differences out, I think, makes a lot of difference too.
Tim and Jen, this was amazing conversation. Seriously, it was so good and filled with wisdom for many, even for us, but for many that will listen, we, Lord willing. And we just are so grateful that you guys were able to share this amazing testimony. It was a pretty big testimony that lasted a couple years, and that you guys gave a great godly example to resolving this issue by coming together, praying and seeking the Lord, which is the best thing that we could ever do in our marriages. And even if we're not married, like if we're seeking for a spouse, like seek the Lord. Everything we do, seek the Lord. And being in marriage, doing that as a couple, as one. And so this was beautiful conversation. We're so grateful to have you today and to share. And please tell our listeners where we can find you, Jen.
So the Art of a Messy House podcast is on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And then my website is theartofamessyhouse.com. And then most of the time I'm on Instagram for some just sharing about the books, the blog, and the podcast there. So
Awesome. And I'll put that in the show notes so that people can find you and reach out to you and hopefully listen to some of your podcasts. So we truly appreciate you, Tim and Jen, for coming on today and just talking about these issues in marriage that may either be resolved or not resolved. And we're grateful that yours was resolved and that you learned from it and that you're able to share and teach with others. So we appreciate your time. Thank you for being here. God bless you.
thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time.
That was a great conversation with Tim and Jen Kosuda. I just really appreciate their humility and just their transparency to be able to share a huge issue in marriage, which sometimes does not go resolved. And a lot of times people don't talk about how many kids they want to have. And in the middle of marriage, I know we have my sister-in-law had a similar situation, but it was such a blessing to have them.
Yes, and they did a great job just bringing out issues that we all have in our marriages, that we all, according to the research, have issues that are just ongoing, that take a really long time to come to some kind of an agreement, or we never come to an agreement at all. And what are we doing in the meantime? We can do things that can hurt the relationship while we're not agreeing. We're just arguing, advocating our own position, not listening to the other person and just getting angry and upset and offended. Or we can take it to the Lord, we can pray about it, and we can spend our time learning what the other person's position is. Let me just ask a lot of questions. How did you come to the conclusion that you came to? How do you think the way that you think? How do you come to the conclusions you're coming to? What experience in the past have you had that makes you feel this way? Just keep asking questions and give statements of empathy. I know it's counterintuitive because it seems like I'm just supporting your position, which will cause you to be more fixed in your position. But research bears out the opposite. It bears out the truth of the Bible, the truth of James 1:19 that says, be quick, slow to speak, but quick to hear. And we can learn from that. The more I advocate for my position, the more the other person advocates their own position, and no one's listening to each other. The more I listen to you and empathize with you, the more open you tend to be about my position and seeing what I think, why I think the way that I think. And the more likely there will be solutions that open up to us when we have a deeper understanding of what's going on, and because we've taken it to the Lord and we're ultimately listening to him and his direction.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all about the Lord, right? Our marriage should reflect Christ. And it's hard and it's not something that's easy, but I think each conflict that we may encounter, we can practice by taking those steps and going to the Lord first. It may not be perfect, but going to the Lord is the best solution at all times. We are learning in marriage ministry. We're constantly learning. So, having conversations with other brothers and sisters in Christ who are going through similar things teaches us as well. And we can go back and teach to others. So, we're so thankful for this podcast. If you want to listen to more podcasts around marriage and family, follow us. And we have a podcast that comes out every single Tuesday. We do a lot of discipling for our children because we really feel like we need to impact the next generation. But the focus too is marriage. So please give us a follow, thumbs up, and share it with a friend. It really helps us to get out there. So we're so thankful that you're here today. Until next time.
God bless.